Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Railroad Safety. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law since the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Carl, Oren, and Jim will discuss railroad highway grade crossing and right-of-way safety, slips, trips, and falls in the railroad environment, rail safety and incident analysis, passenger and railroad worker safety, railroad operating rules, regulations, and industry standards. To give you a little background about our presenter, Carl Berkowitz is the co-director of the Forensic Engineering Institute and has more than 50 years of experience in the transportation engineering and transportation safety field. He has consulted around the world about the safe operation of public and private transportation systems and has been featured on CBS, NBC, YouTube, and in national and local newspapers. He has worked with TASA for more than 20 years. Oren Masory is the co-director of the Forensic Engineering Institute and has over 30 years of mechanical engineering experience. Currently, he is a professor in the Department of Ocean and Mechanical Engineering at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton. His research interests include vehicle accident reconstruction, workplace-related injuries, building and safety codes, and major transportation safety issues with a focus on safe railroad operations. Jim Blaze is a senior advisor at the Forensic Engineering Institute and has more than 45 years of experience in the intermodal transportation safety and railroad industry. He has consulted around the world about railroad operations, business cost benefits, and railroad safety. He is an expert on NERAC and G-Corps train operating rules, AAR, and APTA rules and policies, FTA and FRA technical safety minimum rules and regulations, and FHWA rules, procedures, and design manuals. Attendees who require passcode, the word for today is railroad. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes of the presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with the link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Carl, Oren, and Jim, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. We're going to try to present a 5-day seminar in 1 hour, and really we're going to give you some facts, issues, and ideas to cope with the issues that we discussed. And I apologize for cramming so much material into a short period of time. A lot of the problems we have come from the 1870s, believe it or not, when the king of the road was the railroad. The railroad could do no wrong. And that philosophy apparently still exists around the United States even today. Just take, for example, if you have an average freight train that weighs 12 million pounds and it strikes and it has to stop at 55 miles an hour, it takes 1 mile or 18 football fields to stop the train. Then we know what the end results are when a train hits a person or a vehicle. Here's another example. If a train strikes an automobile, it's the equivalent of a car striking an aluminum soda can. Just to give you some of the statistics, this is between 2012 and 2018, some of the major railroad accidents that occurred in the United States. The last one is the Bright Line, which was just opened a couple of weeks ago in Florida. And I have down 2 killed, but last night the number was added, 1 more was added. Now it's 3 killed. And they're doing a pretty good job of killing somebody once a month, unfortunately. If we look at the nation as a whole, you can see the highway rail incidents that have, first, the blue line is the collisions, the orange is fatalities, and the gray area is injuries. Just this weekend, the NBC TV presented information on railroad accidents, fatalities, and they showed that between 2016 and 2017, the number of fatalities caused by railroads went from 750 to 900, which is the highest number in the last 10 years of railroad fatalities. Not good statistics. Here's a little bit of a breakdown of the last 11 years, showing trespassing, grade crossing, railroad workers, railroad passengers, and other fatalities. And these numbers are not very good either. To try to prevent these things from happening, there are a lot of standards, and these standards are not aspirational. These are standards that have been established by organizations based upon research that's been done by the organizations, their members, and these standards that have been promulgated are sort of a minimum level of standard. In order for an organization to create a standard, there has to be consensus, and consensus is usually at the lowest level of a standard and not at the highest level. But there are a lot of standards out there that can help guide and improve the safety of a rail operation. Most accidents occur either by, 60% of the accidents are a result of human error and some kind of track defect that might exist. And another 17% of those accidents are the result of equipment defects. But there are many other reasons that accidents are caused by, and that is the results by an operator of a train not following the rules and regulations, failure to use their horn at crossings and other locations, or use their horn when there's a danger on the track, inadequate braking, not applying the emergency brake when necessary, loading of cargo, substance abuse. Another study just came out by the National Transportation Safety Board that a big issue among train operators is sleep apnea, and we've had a few major accidents, including one in New York State where sleep apnea was the result, and one in New Jersey where a train went into a terminal and killed a person on the platform, and that driver apparently had sleep apnea as well. Back in the early 1900s, I would say approximately a worker was being killed every hour in the railroad system in the United States, and the Congress felt there was a need to do something immediately. And what they did is they passed the Federal Employees Liability Act to help protect the railroad workers. And this was originally established in 1908, and it intended to protect and compensate workers for their injuries. And I'm not going to get into too much detail. This is the basis by which one can promulgate a suit if required. This is an example. These various boxes show some of the areas that are predominant in terms of employee injuries. These are railroad worker employee injuries. Some of the other kinds of accidents that are quite common, especially in the passenger transportation field, are platform railroad gaps, crowd management, slip, trips, and falls, premature door closings, sudden train movements, and the train operator not doing his job. There are two types of platform to rail car gap accidents. One involves the horizontal, the distance between the edge of the platform and the edge of the train door, and the vertical, which is the top of the platform to the edge of the train door threshold. Both these have standards and guidance that are provided, and these are a major cause of accidents, primarily in the older systems in the United States. Platform crowding is a big problem. There are many reasons that they are caused, and I'm not going to go into each one of them, but here's a comprehensive list of the types of crowding issues that are in existence in our passenger rail systems in the United States. One of the problems that the operators have is how do you measure the number of people and how do you determine the level of crowding? One method is to photograph and count, stand there with a pen and start counting the number of people that you see in a photograph. By that time, whatever the situation is, it's long been passed. Another way of doing it is by having action cues. In this chart, using level of service, which is the number of passengers per square foot, and you can use a cue. By observing the crowd, you could determine the level of crowding that exists on the platform. And I'm not going to get into too much detail. This chart is self-explanatory. As I mentioned earlier, slip, trips, and falls are a major issue, and there are various environments within the passenger transportation system which cause slip, trips, and falls. The ramps, stairs, escalators, rail cars, platforms, people movers, etc., all have a way of causing slip, trips, and falls in the rail passenger environment. Another area, and a very important area, is people being trapped in passenger cars being trapped by the door, either when the train is not moving and even when the train is moving. And here's a list of some of the examples. Recent information released by the New York City Transit Authority. In the last couple of years, there has been an average of 100 door incidents on the New York City subway system. If you expand it to all the passenger rail systems in the United States, we're talking about thousands of door incidents occurring each year, causing lots of injury. Let's talk a little bit about operators who are, they're out there on the front lines and operating the trains, and their job is a very important job. Some of the systems in the United States are fully automated, and they take the operations out of the hands of the operator, but still many of the systems are still manually operated, and there are various issues and errors that can be attributed to an operator. That includes attention, perception, knowledge, violation of rules, violation of procedures, forgetting to do something that you're supposed to do, a lapse in terms of performing the required task, generally outright mistakes, fatigue, are some of the major ones. For somebody to respond to a situation, it takes a certain amount of time. And that time to respond to a situation we refer to as perception reaction time. And a study done at MIT a number of years ago for the federal government, the Federal Railroad Administration, determined that the average time to make a decision to observe something, either a pedestrian or any situation in the track environment, it takes between 1.5 and 2 seconds. It's important because of that time required that an operator is focused and is observing the right-of-way and anticipating, not waiting for an event to take place, but anticipating events, and to look and focus and pay attention. And we depend on the operator's expertise and training to make sure that everything operates as it's supposed to operate. Many times I've read testimony by an operator that the minute they saw a situation, they applied the emergency brake. I discussed that the train operator has a perception reaction time before they can take some action. And one of the actions to take is apply the emergency brake. Unfortunately, that takes time. And that time is between a second and a half and 2 seconds, and that can cause something to happen out of control. There are also track-related accidents, passengers on the right-of-way, passengers falling from the station platform, passengers walking across the tracks. And one of the problems we have in the United States is we show these wonderful pictures of the track environment. You can see a couple getting married on the tracks, kids walking on the tracks. We've romanticized people walking on the tracks. This is a dangerous place. and a place that people shouldn't be walking, and we have to watch what the media presents in terms of track walking, for example. We have to protect people from the right-of-way. You would think that people would be aware that, that trains operate on tracks and they're dangerous. People need to be reminded. I remember when I was in military training, we always had a three-step learning process. Tell people what you're going to tell them what you told them, and constantly repeat what you've told them over and over again, because people tend to forget. And right now we use signs and information and things of that nature. Sometimes we have fencing. Most times the right-of-ways are not fenced. We find lots of times where we find passengers on the tracks. This is a serious situation. They can end up on the tracks by falling, by being pushed, and sometimes even attempt to suicide. The major standards in terms of railroad crossings can be found at the American Public Transit Association guidelines, the Federal Highway Administration manual on railroad crossings, and the manual of uniform traffic control devices, which is statutory in every state in the United States and territories. In designing crossings, there are many issues that we need to address, and here are the primary issues: clarity of the crossing, the visibility, that it's a continuous path, that it's at appropriate intervals, that a person can cross the tracks at short wait. In many places in the United States, children find that there's no access across the railroad tracks, and sometimes they have to walk very long distances to cross the tracks, and that's why they create these informal pathways and not cross it where it's designed to cross, but at other places where they develop these informal crossways to make the crossing across. Other things that need to come into consideration is the durability of the crossing, the compatibility with the existing conditions, the smoothness of the crossing, how wide is the crossing, can two people cross at the same time, and is the surface flush and level and at the top of the rail tracks, and doesn't cause a trip hazard where the crossing and the rail tracks meet. This is a small chart that shows the issue of how much time a pedestrian needs to cross the tracks at different speeds, and how much sight distance the pedestrian needs to see the train before it arrives at the crossing. And Dr. Masory is going to talk more about the issue of sight distance and the pedestrian later on in his presentation. It's important to have a safe pedestrian environment, that encourage people to cross at where it's safe, and to ensure that they do that by designing systems to ensure that they make the crossing at the right place. And in many places in the United States, they're starting to, in addition to crossing gates and signage, they're adding fence gates, which are only open when the train is safe to cross the tracks, such as those pictured in the left-hand corner of this particular slide. There is a treatment that was tried in California. They call it the Z crossing, where you force the pedestrians to look in the direction that the train is traveling. So before they cross the track, they see the train. If a train is coming, they see the train as part of the crossing. They have no choice, but because they're facing that direction in which the train is operating. Another useful device that's being used around the United States is a special signal and sign at the crossing, which has flashing lights at the pedestrian's eye level. And this flashing light not only has red light flashing, it also has a bell that sounds at the same time to make the passenger, the pedestrian, aware of what's happening at the crossing, plus signage as well. There are many issues with vehicle crossings. Many accidents occur in the United States. Not all crossings have gates, and a lot of accidents occur at these crossing locations. And these are some of the reasons that have been determined that are causing accidents at crossings, such as drug and alcohol use, inattention, misjudgment, traffic violations, the inability for a vehicle to stop, disregarding a signal, unaware of the train, environmental factors, and in some cases, the warning systems that were established by the railroad and the local jurisdictions also have an impact. This chart points out the responsibilities of the three major players in any railroad crossing. That's the railroad, the road department that's responsible for that crossing, and the driver, pedestrian, who have to make the crossing. One of the big issues that we read about in the papers almost daily is that drivers and pedestrians are walking around the gates. One technique that's been developed and applied is a very inexpensive one, and that's putting a grade separation between the two directions of traffic moving across the crossing. Additionally, having four-way quadrant gates covering and closing the roadway, as well as pedestrian gates across the walkways and the sidewalks. I'll be happy to take any questions, if there are any questions at this time.
If all the attendees can enter the passcode, which is road, and any questions that you have for the presenters. I have a question. Do you know about Rule 26? How important is Rule 26?
Well, there are state rules 26, but Rule 26 at the federal level is very important. It lays out what the duties and responsibilities of all the parties are in terms of exchanging information and preparing information for the courts to deal with. Rule 26 lays out for the expert what should be included in the report and the formatting of that report, and also how important it is to use a scientific approach in presenting information. Also, at the federal level, there is less informality and more formality. Experts and attorneys have to present information in a timely manner as established by the court. Hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Carl. You can continue with the presentation.
I'll turn it over now to Dr. Masory. Dr. Masory?
Hi. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few topics. One is the visual detection of approaching object, and this is correct for many, many cases. First one is the pedestrian is crossing the rail or trying to cross the street, and he has to estimate what is the distance and what is the time to contact. This is also important when you make a left turn on a road, or if you even play any kind of game where you have to require to catch a ball flying toward you. So as an example, I'm going to show this train. And what's happening is, on the left-hand side, you see your eye, and you see the lens, and you see the retina. As the train approaches, the size of the object, the projected image on your retina increases, but also this angle theta increases. Okay, so you can see this in the next one. So you have theta is here, and then you have theta 1 as the train increases. Now, human is sensitive to the change in the area, this area, the projected area. We are not sensitive to the size of this projected area, but we are sensitive to the rate by which this particular area increases. And this is called looming. Now, there is a certain threshold which is quite well established, which tells you what is the rate that we are sensitive to. And this is given in degrees per second, for example. If this is alpha here is a degrees, if it changes at 5 degrees per second, which means it increases, it will give you some kind of an idea what is the velocity of the object and what is the time to impact. So here's an example, and one of the thresholds that is given in literature is 0.0035 radians per second, which is another measure of angle. And once this rate of change of the angle is reaching, then you are, or the observer is sensitive and say, yes, something is coming toward me. So what you see here is a curve which shows you what is the curve is for a particular speed that the object approaches. And what you find out that for this particular threshold, you detect or you understand that this train or this object is coming to you when it's about 260, 275 feet per second. And therefore, since we know what's the velocity, we can tell you that this particular object will reach you about 8.5 to 9 seconds. And what you see here is calculated for 20 miles per hour. Now, if you change the speed to 70 miles per hour, what will happen is you are going to detect the object by far farther because it's moving by far faster, and therefore the rate of expansion of the image increases. But the worst thing that happened is the time, because of the high speed, the time for impact is become shorter, and this becomes to be like 4.5 or almost 5 seconds. So now if you have a case, for example, in Florida, that one track was used for freight trains which running 15 to 20 miles per hour, and then they are using this for high-speed train which run 70 miles per hour, the guys who used to cross the trail might make a mistake because he's not prepared himself that this train will come and hit him at about 4.5 seconds. The other issue is the same thing as the first warning that you get from the train. So the first warning is about 1/4 of a mile, which is someplace here. It takes time to reach this point, which is 0. Therefore, by the time you hear it, it's about 1,200 feet from you. But when you are looking, you hear the horn and you're looking there, you are going to see the object, the train, but you cannot recognize that the train is really coming toward you because the recognition from looming is only at this particular point. And it doesn't matter if this is a high-speed train or this is a low-speed train. There's always a gap between your understanding or your senses tells you, yes, the train is coming to me, and the warning. So you can watch the train, you hear it, you watch it, but eventually you don't take attention to it. So this is an issue that each time you have either a vehicle or a pedestrian accident with a train or some other cases that somebody has to bring into mind. The second issue that I want to talk about is the sleep trip and imbalance that cause all of them causing a fall. Sleep is a very simple thing. It's an interaction between the footwear and the surface. Trip, it means that as you walk, you engage with irregular change. And imbalance means that you step on imbalanced surface, like a loose tile or a loose brick, something like this. And fall, I think, is a very simple thing to understand. These are the factors that affect all the falls: the gait, the balance, stature, strength, if it's visible or not, etc. I want to go to the real thing, which is here. When it comes to sleep, because of friction, this is the definition. This is eventually the weight of the person, and you try to find out what is the force being supported right here at the surface between your foot or the shoe and the surface. And this is a very simple definition. And the coefficient of friction here is given by the force needed to pull this block to the left, and the normal force, which is eventually the weight. Now, we have to consider the static coefficient of friction, which is some kind of a threshold. Once you are below this threshold, there is a good chance that slip will occur. There are many standards for friction, starting with OSHA, to NC, to ASTM, National Fire Department, state and local building, but all of them eventually collapse to one particular requirement of a certain value for the coefficient of friction. Trip, as I said, there is a difference in, or obstacle difference between two surfaces, and the standards say that the difference cannot exceed a quarter of an inch. And the reason for the quarter of an inch is if you look at the front of your shoe, you see that it's lifted a little bit, about a quarter of an inch. So if you are sliding your foot on this surface, the tip of your shoe or the bottom will not hit this because you are sitting right here. Once it exceeds this number, there is a possibility that a person will slip. Imbalance, if you look at this particular tile, you push here and it falls down or moves down and you can lose your balance. And the same thing with these tiles right here. Now, all this is correct for, stationary, walkways, etc. But when it comes to trains, this problem becomes to be even more severe due to the motion of the train. The train is not running smooth on the track. There is always some lateral forces, maybe axial forces, and this will make the problem by far more severe. Okay, so this was the end of slip and fall. If somebody has a question, I'll try to help right now. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, I'm asking if there's a questions about slip and fall. This is your chance.
Okay. Our first question is, what is being done to prepare for active shooters on trains?
I'm not sure that I got it. What
is being done to prepare for active shooters on trains?
If you want, I could try to answer that, Rochelle.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, there are basically nothing special. From time to time, the railroads, which have very small police departments, assign police to the trains. But in terms of deterrence for active shooters, there's nothing that's being done at this point in time. But there are protocols that deal with when there is an active shooter. And I'm not familiar with any train incidents since the one that occurred on the Long Island Railroad many years ago. There hasn't been very many incidents, to my knowledge, of active shooters on the train, other than the movie that that was recently in the theater concerning 3 American heroes in Europe that stopped a terrorist. Hope that answers that question.
I think I'll continue. So, because this question was not directly related to the topic. Okay, the second topic I want to talk about is accidents, which are we call train side sweep, and this is an example of this. And this happens in derailing, or they're coming to a fork, and the 2 trains trying to share the same track. There are some standards which says this is the maximum acceleration and jerk which are allowed before a passenger, either standing or sitting, will lose his balance and obviously get hurt. This is a standard by ANSI, which I think adopted by the train operators. There are some other details and some other references which provide some other piece of information. So what I want to look at real data. And the real data is something which comes from the black box of the train. And what you see here, you see the time, and this is the speed of the train. The speed is very low because the accident happened in a service place. But this area, this is what's important for us. because this is the place where you can see the speed drop from this point to this point because of stopping. So we have to look at what were the decelerations, let's say between this point and this point, if we exceed the deceleration by the standard. Now, one simple way to do it is just to take 2 points and figure out what is the difference in velocity divided by the difference in time, and you find out what is the acceleration. The real problem is that the information you have is very crude. You know, the information here is like 4 miles per hour. This is 0 miles per hour. This is 5 or 6 miles per hour. And this is very low resolution. So if you go through these calculations, which are very simple, you find out that it's very easy to exceed the required deceleration. Now, with this information, it's very difficult to find the jerk, which is the derivative of the acceleration, which is also specified in the standard. So here I'm just showing this an example where I'm going to take this data and try to figure out what is the jerk. So you try to fit some kind of a curve to this data, because otherwise you cannot take any derivatives. And you go through this, you find out what's the acceleration, what is the jerk, et cetera, et cetera. Whoops, I'm sorry. By the way, in this particular case, with these particular numbers, on this train, there were 2 conductors who are, doing their business. And when the accident occurred, they lost their balance and hurt themselves. Okay. Any question about deceleration and jerk? This is the place.
If all the attendees can enter the passcode for today, which is railroad, and any questions that you have. We have 2 questions, but I'm not sure if it's specific to your part of the presentation. But if anybody can answer.
So why don't we keep this to the end?
Okay.
If it's not okay. So I think at this point, Jim, you have a lot of time.
I'll try not to use it all.
Yeah, so you have more time for questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Blaze. My section is going to deal with, we're going to go back to the grade crossing questions at hand. And we're going to talk about the rules, regulations, and best practices so that you understand the differences. First of all, the Federal Railroad Administration, or the FRA, does issue guidelines, but there are no fast and hard FRA pedestrian regulations. And the first 2 of the deaths that Carl mentioned for the Bright Line service, higher speed service, covered pedestrian accidents. And there's no regulations covering how to protect against that, an increased likelihood of an accident at a grade crossing, because the train speeds are going to be so much faster. In some cases, there is a lot of research that pertains to the Northeast Corridor. That's the NEC, the Amtrak lines between Washington and Boston, where trains can go typically 110, 125 to as high as 135 miles per hour. They're required to go on fenced or separate right-of-way. So what you've done is you've sealed off the corridor, and you've eliminated the possibility of pedestrian crossing and road crossing of vehicles from the accident. That's not the case here in Florida, though. Now, best practices is on the other hand. You use benchmarking to find and test and then deploy the best practices for audio and visual alerts, and best practices for providing advanced automated braking alarms to oncoming train if, in fact, there is an intrusion in a crossing ahead. The facts are, though, that in Florida and in most of the U.S., the best thing that you have for pedestrian protection as well as vehicle protections at these road crossings as best practices are some camera-activated systems. Most do not accurately detect human side images or movements, so they're more or less experimental. And there's the first camera systems that are being deployed in Florida are actually sending a transmission that there's an intrusion in the crossing to a central train dispatching area, rather than increasing the audio or the visual alert sensitivity to the person in the crossing, or sending a braking notice to the oncoming train. So these camera-based systems are not very reliable. Our research concludes that active location detection and direct train communication needs to be the focus for projects like Brightline, where the trains are going to be going considerably faster than what people who live in the area were used to. There is a trespasser protection that would apply not only to the crossings, but to areas that are unfenced between these long stretches of tracks, where particularly children, but also adults, sometimes say, that's too far to go down to the next crossing, so I'm going to cross here. There are trespassing alert technology that can detect that kind of a presence and, again, send a signal to the train to stop braking. So what you have basically is a device that's on the locomotive from an oncoming train, and a device and sensors located at the crossings. The devices at the crossings detect the pedestrians and or bicycles or vehicles in the crossing ahead of an oncoming train and send a signal. These devices use radio frequency waves. That's not radar waves. There are radar frequency wave devices, but they tend to be much more expensive and not necessarily more reliable. Radio frequency technology that is being deployed right now, so it could have been deployed in the case of the Brightline Florida East Coast service, but was not, are relatively simple to wire. They wire right into the existing crossing devices because all those crossing devices have to have electricity. And they're relatively simple and small locomotive modules to put into the locomotive. They can work on the same freight or passenger locomotive, irrespective. This slide here, number 80 of 89, simply says, well, these devices can also be located on poles or other apparatus set up in unfenced areas or areas where there's a likelihood that because of the density of population to both sides of the right-of-way, people are probably not going to go down to the protected grade crossing. They may try to include and cross between the crossing areas. So this addresses the issues such as children crossing between schools, homes, and shops. The same type of device on the poles. It detects using radio frequency waves that there's a human being-sized person or item in the track, and it sends a communication signal directly to the oncoming locomotive engine, which basically signals brake. Now, I'm not sure that these trains are always going to be able to stop, but the point is they will start to decelerate, thus maybe on occasion reducing some accident that would result otherwise in the death to an injury. So these are what I call missed best practices. What I mean by that is the Federal Railroad Administration, in consultation around the United States, held various conferences between 2012 and 2015, which I've gone through and assembled in my library, or safety library. But that research on what to do about pedestrians and vehicles in crossings and establishing warnings to oncoming higher speed trains like Brightline really are not required by regulation. Federal Railroad Administration issues what we call, because it's by groupthink and highest vote total, what I call minimal recommendations, not best practices. And despite the fact that there were some Tiger grants awarded by the federal government to various counties in southern Florida that were participating in the Florida East Coast and Brightline upgrading programs under review by the FRA. These best practices were not required under the Florida state law or the federal law as an safety upgrade. So I think those are what I call missed opportunities. And you have to remember what's happened here is that the chance of an accident occurring is going up arithmetically quite high because these trains are now approaching at set speeds. The Brightline trains are approaching at set speeds of about 79 miles an hour. That's the maximum permitted under federal law for these types of tracks. And that's considerably higher than the 35 miles an hour to maybe 55 miles an hour that freight trains have been passing throughout the years. And so you've got that near doubling of speed of approach, this looming. And there's also at least 22 trains a day now being operated. That would jump to 32 once the service is expanded to Orlando, whereas before you were only having 10 to 14 trains a day, typically on the freight-only railroad. So now we're up to some 30 trains a day. So the chance of an incident occurring is quite higher. The existing system that is uses this radio frequency wave technology is out in the market. It has been deployed on at least one other working railroad in the United States. This is just a reminder here on this slide. Final word on federal safety regulations. It's basically a minimalist approach to safety minimums. And I think I'm going to end there because that's the only thing that I had scheduled to say today. And we can go back to questions by the audience.
Thank you. If all the attendees can enter the passcode for today, which is railroad, and any questions that you might have. I believe this question is for Jim. What motivation is there for railroads to use this new technology if they have no duty toward trespassers?
Well, there's two motivations. One is the public relations statement. Every time there's an accident, there's a standard line that goes out. It's almost like it's written into the brain of the public relations officer. Well, safety is our first priority. Really? There's cost-benefit analysis that goes into this work. And what the railroads have failed to realize is that what the true cost of an accident incurred is much higher than what normally the Association of American Railroads or the Federal Railroad Administration or even the National Transportation Safety Board puts into their economic spreadsheets. The true costs basically are known only to the financial officer and the insurance officer and the legal officer of these companies. And they're never really assessed when you're looking at weighing it to whether or not to deploy a safety apparatus. And so the cost-benefit analysis always underestimates the risk. So that's the number one thing that the railroad industry as an industry has got to change. If they're going to start deploying better safety apparatus, they have to understand what their total costs, including the liability costs associated with litigating these damages are, or they won't be motivated to basically spend the capital money up front to prevent the accidents.
Next question. Are there any special considerations involved with the high-speed passenger trains that are contemplated or are now being built in the USA?
Well, there's two kinds of trains. There's what we call faster trains, like Brightline, and then there's the ultra-fast trains or very fast trains, which would go 300 to 350 kilometers an hour, such as is proposed in California. The first 100-some miles to be operational sometime in the next 4 years, or the upgrading of the Northeast Corridor trains from their existing top speeds of 135 miles an hour. There's proposals that the next generation of solid-like equipment will be delivered soon, and that those trains might go as fast as 150, 160 miles an hour. But other than fencing that's required and complete grade separation, the best practices I've seen so far are that practiced by the state of North Carolina, which is called their sealed corridor, where basically they try to close a lot of these crossings and make them underpasses or overpasses, and then basically put in quad gates, as Carl had previously mentioned, or deploy some of this newer technology, as I suggested, is out there but hasn't yet been fully deployed by anybody other than one transit system, using radio frequency waves to improve the detectability and then communicate directly to the braking apparatus on the train. So those are limited things. The deployment is basically up to the railroad and the governments that sponsor the railroads and the local communities. It's not an initiative that's being pushed by either the railroad companies or by the vendors that build the train sets.
Next question, I believe, is for Oren. It seems that a physical barrier such as fencing or gates would effectively prevent trespassing pedestrians from trespassing at the level grade crossings. Why hasn't this become the norm or the standard? Has this been studied?
I think this is better for Carl to answer. Carl?
There's always studies going on. The way to make a railroad safe is by closing the right-of-way, as they've done on the Northeast Corridor. And that's the only place in the United States, basically, that we have closed corridors where there are no crossings. That's the only way you can make it safe. There's no other way to make a right-of-way safe other than closing it off to the general public.
With separation.
Either with fencing or with separation.
Next question. What information should the attorney investigating a possible train pedestrian death case look at to determine if negligence or not on part of the railroad?
If you want, I'll give a start at that. Basically, one needs to look at all the information that is available. There's a lot of information that is available. For example, if the accident occurs at a crossing, the gate information, if there are gates, there are downloads, information we can download from the gates, what happened at the gates, when the gates were deployed, when they were not deployed. On the train itself, there are generally upfront video cameras which show what's happening in front of the train. There's also what we call event recorders, which record the actions of the train, whether the horn was sounded, whether the horn wasn't sounded. We have all these various national standards of care and national standards, such as the various standards that have been developed and promulgated by that list of organizations I gave early in the presentation, as well as the manuals and handbooks that have been generated from those standards.
Next question. Have you handled any trapdoor leveling equipment between car platform accidents on commuter rail cars?
A lot of the train systems have two types. Well, it could have even three types of platforms. We have what we call the high-level platform, where you get off the passenger train right onto the platform, or the mid-level or low-level platform, where you have to take the stairs down to the platform. Between the two different types of operation, the high-level platform and the mid- and low-level platform, there's a plate that separates the stairs from the passenger entering or exiting the train at the high level. That's called the trapdoor.
Next question. Do you have any recommendations for how council can determine what railroad owns a particular crossing or set of tracks? This becomes important in naming the correct defendant.
Each piece of property in the United States there's a land deed somewhere, and the land deed will indicate who owns the property. And that's usually registered with a town, a county, a municipality where that railroad passes through. It's like a title search for a piece of real estate. Same kind of process. You do a title search and you determine who owns that property.
This is Jim Blaze. The railroad also has in its possession a valuation sheet, which is on file with the federal government regulatory surface transportation boards. And the FRA requires that if it's at a crossing, the crossing has to have a ID number who says who's crossing, who is responsible as a company for that crossing. So multiple ways to do that.
Thank you, Jim.
Question. How does one obtain permission to inspect the right-of-way, a train, platform, etc., after an accident but before the lawsuit is filed?
Well, if you don't make a request of the railroad, you'll be trespassing. So you want to make that request of the railroad. And generally speaking, they will arrange for the inspection to be conducted. And in some cases, with the Northeast Corridor, before you can do an inspection in the Northeast Corridor, you have to go to school. So anybody who's going to go onto the right-of-way needs to be trained. And in fact, you have to go to a half-day school that's run by Amtrak to enter their right-of-way. But railroads will generally be accommodating if given sufficient time to do an inspection of their facility.
Next question. How can one distinguish between human error or negligence versus software defects, and what is different in liability?
Well, that's not a very simple question. You have to look at all the information and analyze the information, and there's no simple answer to that question. But any issue that involves that there's information available to evaluate, an expert can evaluate that information and make recommendations and determinations. That's why we're called experts.
Next question. Are there any standards to make a passenger train crash-worthy in the event of a collision or derailment?
Well, I'll do part of it. Jim can probably add to it. The Congress, several years back, passed additional regulations. It's the 49 CFR 200 to 299, which requires rail cars to be reinforced in the front to make them more collision worthy in terms of collision. The older cars don't have that reinforcement, but any cars being built in recent years are heavily reinforced in the front to make them more collision worthy. You want to add to that, Jim?
Yeah, the Federal Railroad Administration, Carl, also has a group that does the mechanical crushworthiness testing and certification. So, for example, the Acela, which is French design, Canadian manufactured under license here in the U.S., and the Talgo, which is Spanish designed and manufactured, I believe, in Milwaukee, both had to undergo rigorous testing to meet the crashworthiness testing metric standards, engineering standards set by the FRA. So there are rules and procedures in place for testing that. And then, of course, they also usually are bought, that newer equipment is brought out to the Pueblo test labs for hard testing.
That's a facility that the federal government operates out in Colorado to test rail equipment and facilities.
Next question. Are there any standards for making sure train horns can be heard at the crossing?
Well, there's a rule, a federal rule as to when a horn is supposed to be sounded and also the amount of decibels that it's supposed to emit. And generally speaking, the horn should be sounded between 15 and 20 seconds before reaching a crossing, except for where a quiet zone is established, and then the horn is not used.
This is Jim. Can I interject a counter to that? The Tiger grants and the state of Florida and the local communities along the Bright Line service route have been working with the FRA harder, in my opinion, on establishing quiet zones, which would reduce the amount of horn noise, as opposed to putting in safety energy effort to introduce the new automatic braking technology that would warn trains to brake in the event somebody is in a crossing. So there is a disconnect here on what society wants And you can see this coming as a tension between forces along the community who want to be safe, but they don't want to hear the train horns.
And our last question, are there significant differences in the railroad accident rates of the various railroad companies?
Yes, there are, because they operate in different environments. It depends on whether they're operating in urban areas, rural areas, real rural areas, areas where, you know, they call it dead zones, or I forget there was a movie after these sections of railroad where there is even no communication between the railroad and the train control centers. So it depends on what environment they're operating with.
Yeah, and that information is generally public available if you know where to look for it.
The federal government maintains records on every accident, and you can go to the Federal Railroad Administration. If you know the crossing or the right-of-way or the railroad you're looking for, you can get every type of accident that occurred over the last 20 years, I would imagine. Right, Jim?
I'm not sure how many years it is, but the point is correct. There is an information database, which is why you usually hire an expert to go and find that stuff for you.
Thank you. And
thank you, Rochelle.
Thank you. Any unanswered questions will be sent over to our presenters for today. In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts for the more than 60 years, TASA also offers free interactive webinars, expert written articles, research reports on expert witnesses, including the Challenge History Report 2.0 and Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Carl Berkowitz, Oren Masory, and Jim Blaze for their time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with our presenters, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. Thank you all for attending. This concludes our program for today.